Let me get myself mic'd properly. This is a brown ale. That's sufficient. Yeah, that's a sample.
I was told there was excellent free pop here.
Yes. Yes, free pop.
So what was this again?
It's a brown ale. No, it's just a brown ale. It is not all grain. It's a Best Yet, which is a company out of Kent, Ohio, kit. So it's a blended kit in terms of, comes in a little box, is relatively inexpensive to make a $5 batch. You should start recording because this is kind of the beginning of my...
Actually.
Okay, good.
I'm tasting a weird, like, sugar, like a brown sugar, like at the very end.
Nope, nothing weird in it at all.
I'm not a beer drinker, and this is awesome. This is
It-
really good.
That's why you should brew your own beer, because 5 gallons, which is a little more than 2 cases of beer, for $26 for the ingredients. About, what'd you spend, Colonel? About $100 for the equipment I had you buy?
For the startup stuff.
Yeah, for all the startup stuff, and
your CO2 stuff, that's another 100 for that.
yeah, but you don't need that. That depends on how you want to drink. But we'll start at the beginning. This kit to make a red ale, which is a red ale, same quality as what you guys are drinking, costs $26. It includes some malt extract, which is essentially the hard part of brewing your own beer, making this. This is dried malt sugar, essentially. Dump that. And the kit also comes with roasted grains. This is where this is what makes these kits better than a lot of the other just brew your own homebrew, is you actually do get a bag of grains and you make tea with this. And this is where the good flavor that these kits comes from, as opposed to just the extract or the hopped extract. Because some of the homebrew kits that you get will just give you a can of stuff. And that can is can of malt extract pre-hopped, and you just kind of rehydrate it like making orange juice in the pot and then ferment it. And those just aren't as good. This is closer to how a real brewery is doing it, which would be, a real brewery would start with 10 pounds of this and make the beer from that, and a lot more water. But that takes 8 to 10 hours to brew, because you have to not boil it, but keep it hot, and get all the sugar out of the roasted grains. Essentially what you're doing when you do a kit like this, fill a pot up with a couple gallons of water, make tea with the grains, so in the 170 degree range, doesn't matter too much, not boiling. You boil it, it burns, and you can't drink the beer.
Have you tried?
I haven't had the misfortune of burning any of the grains yet, but I have some friends who brew using propane outside, and it's much harder to regulate the temperature on the propane, and so, oops. And they've burned it, and it wasn't drinkable beer. Once you make the tea, you add the malt, and then bring it up to a boil, and you drop in. These kits come with pelletized hops. The pelletized hops are not as good as fresh hops, but they're a little bit more controlled. So it's easier for them to measure out how much hops is really going to end up in there. Fresh hops is a flower, and so it looks a little bit like weed in a flower. So you get an actual bud, and these are then pelletized and crushed, and that's what gives beer its aroma, and was originally used as a preservative when they first made beer. I'm going to get out some hops and pass it around, and you guys will all recognize the beer smell from hops. Yeah, it's a little old, it's been in there, and you smell it. And it just kind of smells the way a good beer smells, and the way this smells. Because it has a fairly large amount of fresh hops. Once you have that in there, it's boiling, cook it for 55 minutes, and then you dump in another round of hops, and that adds the aroma because it's not cooked for a long time. That's what gives it the beer smell. Once it's all cooked and everything, you're only cooking it for an hour. So it takes about an hour and a half to get a batch done cooking. Between heating up the water and making the tea part, it takes about an hour and a half. Then you cool it down. I usually just dump it in the sink. Not dump it in the sink, but put the pot in the sink in cold water bath to cool it off quickly. Once it gets down to a reasonable temperature, you dump it into one of these big glass jugs. These are a 6.5 gallon jug. Generally, you put about 2 gallons of what's called a wort, which is what that is after it's been cooked, into your jug and strain it. What the straining does is those pelletized hops kind of disintegrate and turn into a gunk. You really want to filter that gunk out because you don't want it in your beer. You end up with enough gunk already from the dead yeast. Once it's in here, you fill the rest of it up with water. I just use tap water. You can use fancier water, and it's not a, but the beer that I make tastes fine, and that's just Kent City tap water. Once it's in here, get it to a reasonable temperature. When you buy one of these, they're like $20. Holds 6.5 gallons of liquid, and so you got to figure out how much 5 gallons is, mark it. There's a magic marker line on here that you can't see, and the one on here has been washed off. But mark it. You can barely see the remains of the line. And fill it up to that. Make sure you buy a strip thermometer so you can know what temperature it's at. These thermometers are marked with temperature ranges. Ales should be brewed between 66 and 70, 72 degrees. So house temperature. That's useful. You can just sit it in your closet and it should be fine in terms of temperature. Once it's adjusted to that temperature, because when you get the hot stuff from cooking it and you pour cold water in there, the temperature will be all over the place. Let it sit for a couple hours and then the temperature will settle down to within the range, and add yeast. A lot of I've gotten out of the habit of buying liquid yeast. One of the things you can do to very improve your quality is buy a liquid yeast, which is, this is a packet of yeast. It looks like baking yeast. So it's dry. It looks pretty much identical to the baking yeast you use to make bread. You can buy a liquid yeast that is not in a freeze-dried form, so it's alive. And in theory, that will start the batch faster because it's alive. It doesn't need to be reconstituted. It'll be more successful in preventing wild yeast infestation because when this is first dumped in there, it is a nice temperature sugar water solution. There isn't really much better things for growing yeast in. So you got to be relatively careful about sterilization. That's the advantage of using glass. You can put all kinds of crazy chemicals in here to clean it out and get it actually clean. A lot of the kits will sell you something like that ale pail down there, which is plastic, and it just doesn't clean well. Even in there for a week, and you can see the crusty line that gets around here because it foams up and bubbles, and not good in plastic. It just doesn't ever come out right. And then it's stained, and then it smells funny after a while, and then it smells and tastes funny. Too much hair in the microphone. So liquid yeast is better, but it costs $4 or $5 a batch, and so I tend not to use it because I'm cheap. Dry yeast, reconstitute it in warm water, and dump it into the jug. A week later, you get something that looks like this. Somewhere during the next day, after you put it in there, it should start bubbling here, meaning the yeast is reproducing by producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. You keep it in an airlock so it doesn't get contaminations from outside air. You don't get wild yeast infections. But the carbon dioxide can come out that the yeast makes when it produces alcohol. After about a week, you can see there's a pretty large amount of sediment in the bottom, and this is dead yeast. That's why almost always get a new mic.
You can leave that one on.
Okay.
Just for the video.
Oh. I get 2 inks. Interesting. Okay. That's why I almost always move it to a secondary stage. You give it a week in here to do most of the converting sugar to alcohol, and then dump all the stuff except the crap on the bottom into another fermenter and let it sit for another couple weeks. That means this doesn't end up in the bottom of your cup at the end when you drink it. So you've kind of got to pay attention to how much you dump it out of there. To that, yeah, that'll give it a funny taste too. And you need to leave it fermenting longer. It also makes it easier to clean if you don't leave it like this because until yesterday, the day before, there was an inch or two of foam up on the top of here where this residue is, and that goes away, and the sooner I open that all up and clean off that, the easier it is to do. To the end of not bringing this stuff and not stirring all that up, almost always you transfer it by a siphon. So you get a hard tube, you stick down there, and you stand around with it about there inside and drain it into the other one. It doesn't stir up all the residue on the bottom. You can actually get everything out without messing it. The only time I really dump it is when I'm putting it in there from the wort, and then I'm filtering it, because I don't do a filter stage at the end. The only filtration I do is making sure all the hops doesn't end up in the jug. Once it's in the secondary fermenting stage, you can really leave it there for as long as you want. As long as you keep water in the airlock, it'll sit there for a month and it'll be okay. Much more than 2 or 3 months, the beer will start to get old and won't be as good. But it kind of depends on how lazy you are, because the bottling or whatever happens at the end is the most work. Lots of cleaning, lots of mess being made. That's kind of the next thing to talk about is, well, you guys have any questions about actually getting to that stage?
What was the company you bought your kit from?
Grape and Granary. It's in Akron, Ohio. They have a pretty nice website. I prefer to buy this kind of stuff in the store because then you make sure you're getting the right kind of stuff. You can always, I get the kits mail order because
I did find a local store around here if anyone's interested in heading down there, right on Mayfield, down towards Coventry. There's something called Warehouse Beverage. It has some decently priced things.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's also Rosie's Wine House in Lakewood.
Yeah.
Do they sell beer making stuff as well?
We have a place where I live, and because you get tapped into like other breweries.
Yeah.
You get advice.
Yeah.
Somebody you can call and just, dude, it smells like skunks.
Right. Right. There's definitely. There was
A lot of little, like, feels like all the shops are their own little sub-communities of like this.
Yeah, and that kind of thing. It's all. I've never done it before. How does it work? It's not. You want to make sure you're buying the right products and make sure you just need somebody to talk to make sure it's the right stuff for you. That you're going to like the kind of beer you're ordering. I mean, because they have kits, all different kinds. I mean, this in here right now is a porter. There's a red ale, and what's in here is a brown ale. What's in my secondary fermenter at home is a Dos Equis clone. So you just make all different kinds of beer. You got to make sure you pick something you like, because even if it's good beer, if it's not a style you like, well, you just wasted $30. You might find somebody to drink it, but in general.
So the yeast is a lot like baking yeast.
Yeah.
Can you use baking yeast?
Yes, it won't turn out as well because these are actually a strain of yeast designed for this style of beer.
I worked in a bakery and we used to get the live yeast in pound cubes, and he got it from Budweiser.
Yeah, I mean, you can use the yeast, but they are typed out for different styles of beer, in theory. You can also save this sediment and put it in a bottle and cap it and use it next time you make a batch. You don't have to buy liquid yeast every time. Just keep it in the fridge. You know, the sludge, because the sludge in the bottom is some dead yeast, but a lot of just sunk to the bottom yeast. And if you give it a little bit of sugar, seal it up, but make sure you give it a real little so the bottle doesn't explode. you can keep the yeast.